Really, I'm just. I was just.
I don't know his name, but
I was.
the one that used it. I think it's
Was that right? No, it's not right.
It could be a solid. It's not Nigeria. Oh,
Like that first one,
it's probably a solid.
Need and a little bit about.
We have a drive. Easier to plug in.
Yeah, either way, like the drive. I'll hold on to it. Okay, yeah, I can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a combo of students who are here for my com theory, also some students who are sticking around in my previous class. I expect we'll have a pretty healthy, pretty healthy.
Okay. I mean, I can say. Are you on your? Mari's Fana. Was it?
Yeah.
Was it? I didn't even mean to get that. Are you still?
Getting a little bit finicky.
Sure.
Let's do that again. You can only do it once.
All of that for you.
You have a loud.
Yeah, we were. That's a team.
Says that, yeah, I don't hear you go over your file.
You're fine.
And then I'm just gonna enable the screen share for it, so that way,
Yeah.
you know, that or whoever is doing remotely or recording is able to see that. Student welcome to use oh yeah, you've got the clicker set up too. Awesome. Yeah, so we'll start in just a little bit at 11. Oh, that's gonna give you a quick introduction. Sure. Yeah, and then when you go back in, if you're just willing to renable that.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Did it
Yeah,
stop? I didn't mean to.
since you closed out of the full screen, it just closed.
Oh, it's minimized.
Oh, it's so finicky.
Yeah.
Sorry. Like an embedded video.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had hit or miss luck. So it's not
Yeah.
good.
Sweet.
So we want to expand this there again.
Yeah, so.
I'm gonna run to the restroom.
Either single or double is fine. Yeah, so just about a paragraph or two. Yeah. Hey, what's up, Jack?
It's a little bit loud.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I know that you said that we're gonna be doing a cover letter, but I was wondering because I couldn't find it on Canvas. That was underneath something else.
Yeah, so on the front page of Canvas, there is the cover letter. Check out here is here under additional resources.
Sorry.
And then the cover letter template, I can give you like a sense of right? So it's just a chance there. Here are the changes that I made. Maybe off.
You put that in attachment to our final. Like,
Yeah.
paper.
I'll turn it in as an attachment or you can put it in. Oh, I can actually, if it's easier for you, I can put on.
Yeah, maybe turn
Yeah.
I'll talk to you about it.
Right, we've got a packed house, so let's go ahead and get started. As mentioned, through Canvas announcements last week, this week's gonna work a little bit differently. This Monday and Wednesday, we have 2 candidates for new faculty position in communication studies at EOU. Communication studies, we're incredibly happy to introduce Dr. Jonathan Lundy, who will be providing a 30-minute teaching demonstration. After this, we'll hear from our student discussion leaders for their presentations. So Dr. Lundy earned a PhD in communication, culture, and media from Drexel University in 2021. Dissertation research looks at vintage toy collection by adults as a facet of generational identity and expression of material media fandom, transmedia storytelling. So Dr. Lundy will be sharing this teaching presentation with you. Has been asked to talk about communication, theory, and media. So we look forward to this presentation and thank you all for being here. So with no further ado, we will take it away.
Hello, everybody. How are you? Good. You good? Is it 1 week till finals? Where's the tension level? One to 5?
It's up there.
It's up there? Okay. Well, either way, you only have 1 week left, right? So that's how you gotta look at it. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it. As has already been announced, my name is Jonathan Lundy, so you can just call me Jonathan, that's fine. Today I'm going to talk to you about some of my favorite, kind of an area of media studies theory called media ecology. You might have had some exposure to it already, but there's a couple of scholars in here that are kind of my favorites. And full disclosure, if you didn't get it from the dissertation title about adults collecting toys, I am quite a bit of a nerd, so I'm sure you can kind of pick up on that. But I've been studying media both as a system, both the relationships between our culture and media and our individual lives, how they play out in media and through media for quite a while. So I'm going to talk about a couple different things. Hopefully you will be able to identify with some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. But I'm going to start off with this slide. You probably already kind of read it on here. So if you can't make it out, there's 2 fish, right? And one says, "I'm not sure, Dad, but I think I wet the bed." This is actually kind of a comic related to a classic concept. Has anybody ever heard of the phrase or the question, "How does a fish know it's wet?" Anybody ever heard that before? Okay. Well, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you this question. Can a fish know it's wet?
No,
No. Why can't a fish know it's wet?
because it's always there.
Because it's always wet. That's one. What else? So it doesn't know anything other than its own existence, right? Because it's always immersed in water. And if to know what being dry is, what would it have to do?
Become dry.
It'd have to become dry, which means it'd be out of the water and die, right? Maybe we can resuscitate it or whatever. But let's say that it is. So this comic is kind of a play on that. So it's kind of a classic thought question, right? Can a fish know that it's wet? What this is getting at is the idea that there's some things in our lives that we are so immersed in, it's around us all the time, like air, right? If I ask you to tell you, like ask you, what does air feel like? Or what is your relationship to air? You'd have to think a little bit about it to articulate it because it's just always around you. Similarly, that's what kind of media is today, right? If I ask you like, you know, how much media were you exposed to today? Probably like a hard question to answer, right? Because if we really expand that out, media could be the billboards that you drove by to get here today. It could be the posters that are up on the walls here. It could be all the social media that you access today, the shows that you watch during class when you're supposed to be in a lecture or talk, right? All these like things. So a lot of exposure to media, and it's hard for us to know kind of our relationship to it or the effects that it has on us individually and culturally without kind of taking a step back. And so this branch of research that I'm talking about is broadly called media ecology. And you probably heard the term ecology before. What's ecology? If somebody's studying ecology, what is that? What are you studying? One word starts with an E. The environment, yeah. And so we're usually talking about like what's outside, right? So the environment, not just any particular environment, but different environments, right? There's different environments here in La Grande, there's different environments in Portland, there's different environments in Antarctica, right? So it's when we talk about ecology, we're talking about the relationship between everything that exists within a particular environment. So that includes things like plants, includes animals, right? Geography, all kinds of different things. So that's ecology in a nutshell, right? And that's, you know, for those of you that have more familiarity with it, that's a very bare bones version. But media ecology is kind of that viewpoint, right? We're looking at media systems, particularly ones that we interact with all the time and have a large influence. So my guess is that some of you are familiar with this thing called social media, right? So yeah. Anyway, but social media. Think about your social media environment, how much they intersect with your daily lives. And I think most of us think of these as entertainment a lot, but also think about the significance they have with connecting you to your family members who may or may not live close to you, professionally, right? Maybe even you know, from school perspective, you know, a big trend in the last 10 years has been recruiting students for college using social media, right? Colleges have Facebook groups, Instagram, you know, page, like all these different stuff, right? So it's really, and you guys know this is not an option for you. If you want to be social at all in 2023 as young people, social media plays a role at some point, right? Maybe you're not as big of a user as some other people, but the environment of social media interacts with a lot of different things. So, you know, like if somebody's a media ecologist, they might study how different genders interact, members of different genders interact with social media differently, right? Do some, for instance, social media platforms, do they cater to one kind of gender version of reality than others? It used to be, what's it called? Reddit. Anybody familiar with Reddit? So Reddit used to be like a platform that was kind of more geared towards, I think more, was it Reddit? Yeah, it's Reddit. So Reddit was kind of a platform that originally was kind of meant for female audience, right? But it's expanded out from there. There's different platforms too that we might associate with members of certain generations. Ethnicity, we could ask questions about that. Do members of different ethnicities use social media differently or similarly? Okay, so what we're talking about here is the interaction between different types of social media. Not just the technology, but also the social effects that they have. And again, going back to this idea of like, you know, can a fish know it's wet? It's really hard for us to kind of know the impact of social media in general, because we're around it all the time, right? We can't see the matrix code because we're just living in it all the time. Now, one of the biggest scholars to kind of start this field of media ecology, his name is Marshall McLuhan. You might have heard his name before. Does anybody Have anybody ever heard of him before? Okay, does anybody remember the phrase that he's known for? The medium is the message, right? We're going to talk about that a little bit more here. But this guy, he was kind of considered the preeminent media studies scholar, context scholar of the 20th century, so last century, and he died quite a while ago. But his work has lived on, and so there's a couple different contributions that he made to the field. I found this cool little short video that's kind of explained his perspective and perhaps a more articulate way than I could, or at least a more succinct way.
The medium is the message, declared Marshall McLuhan. He even wrote a book with that name, except that when the proofs came back from the typesetter as the medium is the massage, he liked the mistaken title so much he kept it. This has confused people ever since, though he might have intended a visual pun on massage and mass age. But what does the medium is the message really mean? It's a deliberately paradoxical statement. When you get a message, it's the message that's the message, isn't it? The content rather than its form. McLuhan's genius was to focus on the medium itself. He argued that throughout history, what has been communicated has been less important than the particular medium through which people communicate. The technology that transfers the message changes us and changes society, the individual, the family, work, leisure, and more. Take the shift from oral cultures to print-based ones, for example. McLuhan thought the printed word encouraged an emphasis on the visual, whereas in earlier oral cultures, when speech was everything, the dominant sense organ had been the ear. The electronic media of his day, the telegraph, radio, television, and the telephone, were, he thought, unifying people and encouraging participation, though perhaps at the expense of greater conformity. What was emerging was some kind of global village. It's almost as if he was writing about the internet.
Okay, so there's a lot of ideas packed into that short little video, but a couple of them touched on what kind of Marshall McLuhan's contributions to media ecology was. And one of his big ideas related to this idea of the medium as the message is the medium. And what is the medium? Let's just clarify that. I don't mean the Long Island variety. What's a medium? Okay, a form, right? So we talk about the difference between content and form for sure. So medium is actually, media is the plural form of medium. So a medium we could describe as a channel, right? So anything that we use to communicate. So what channels am I using to communicate right now? You said something quietly. So yeah, so I am using audio visual technology. That's one of the channels, but what else am I using? My voice, right? Which is going on airwaves, right? So there's a lot of different channels that we're using, right? I'm using visual, I'm using auditory ways to communicate. So again, a medium is a channel. It's any way that we use to communicate. So this could be text messaging, it could be email. When we think of mediums, we usually think of technological mediums, but we have to remember that we're also using our human voice as a medium. But what mainly his focus was on technological mediums. And one of his big ideas was that the medium that we use to communicate, or the channel that we use to communicate, is as important, if not more important, than the content itself. So regardless of the messages that are being sent on Facebook, the idea of Facebook, the technology of Facebook, or any other social media has a greater effect on us personally and culturally than the messages that we send. I'm going to give you a more pertinent example of that in just a moment. Because the idea of the medium of the message has both kind of an individual micro component to it and a macro component. The macro component is kind of what was touched on in that video when he was talking about the idea of like oral culture versus written culture, right? So he kind of actually defined human history using several what we call epochs or eras, we could say, so time periods, right, in which humans communicated. So the first one he defined as oral communication. And human beings did not always have the ability to communicate through language. Language was something that was invented, right? It's like the alphabet. We think of the alphabet as something that just exists, but really it had to be invented. People also invented, different languages depending on where they were at. And when oral communication was the primary mode of the ways in which we communicated with each other, one of his points is that the ear was probably the most dominant sense. And why was the ear the most dominant sense? If your main mode of communicating important information, history, religion, right, all this stuff is communicated orally, why would the ear be important? Because you're listening all the time, right? And associated with that is also memory, right? If you live in a storytelling culture, if you have the best memory, you hold a lot of social power, right? If you can remember stories from years ago and recount them word for word, right? All these different things, you hold a tremendous amount of social power, right? So oral communication culture, right? And we still have some communities within the world that use a lot of oral communication, but those are very dwindling, if not almost extinct now, because of technology and evolution and all kinds of different things. But after oral communication, we had let's say the era of the written word. So this was this is when people started transcribing language or codifying language using symbols, right? And so we think of like our alphabet, but originally they were pictures, right? Cave paintings and all of this other stuff. But eventually it evolved to more systematic languages like the English language, as among many others. And so when we transitioned away from oral cultures and started adopting more writing-based culture, his argument was that the I became the most dominant sense, right? And similar question, why would the I be the most dominant sense when writing became the most prominent form of communication? Yeah, because we have to read, right? To read, we use our eyes, right? If we're able-bodied, right? There are people who don't have vision impairment, they'll use Braille and some other things. But the I became the more dominant sense. So again, what he's talking about is that the invention of communication technology doesn't just change the way we communicate, it changes like our whole society, it changes our whole culture. So we started using our eyes more, right? Some scientists will even say that our eyes became more acute and attuned to different things. We started using them for different things. Some people would even argue that our vision got worse when we started reading more, where we used to be able to see far away when we were living outside of society, living out in natural landscapes. We needed good vision, but it was to hunt, right? It was to find things, look for danger. But now when we're reading something in front of us, our vision doesn't need to be that good anymore, right? So then we started mechanizing communication, and this is the invention of the printing press. And there's some debate about where the first mechanized printing press came from, whether it was in China or Europe, but you've probably heard of Gutenberg's Bible and the Gutenberg printing press, and roughly that's considered to be one of the biggest advances, at least in Europe, to contribute to mass communication. And so that was roughly in the 1500s. So we're talking about, quite a while ago. So in the 1500s, we had the invention of the printing press, although there were precursors to it around the world. And when in the printing press in particular changed the world in many ways. Before, some of you might have grown up, anybody here grow up in a Judeo-Christian faith, going to church, reading the Bible, right, or any other sacred text? Before the invention of the printing press, most Bibles, and I'm just using it as a common frame of reference, were hand scribed. So think about how big the Bible is, right? And how much text you would have to hand write. So if you wanted a copy of the Bible, it was hand scribed. Now the printing press helped change that. It allowed us to mass produce things relatively cheaply, but it had some other effects to it. For instance, it took control away from the Catholic Church, which controlled the flows of information. If you wanted to know what was said in the Bible, most people were illiterate in Europe at the time, so they had to go to somebody that could read it. And usually most of the Bibles were owned by the Catholic Church. They were the only ones that could afford to have them transcribed. So they would go to church to know what God said in the Bible, right? But with the printing press, it democratized society in kind of an unintended way. It made things cheaper. People could have their own version of the Bible at home if they could afford it. And that encouraged people to become literate, because why have a Bible if you can't read it on your own? So that inspired mass education, public education, schools and universities started becoming more prominent. So again, this idea that when we introduce a new communication technology, and this transition from oral culture to writing is a technology, and so is the printing press, it doesn't just change the way we communicate, it changes society in a lot of different ways. Then we had the telegraph. The telegraph was the first form of electronic communication. And so, and it was the precursor to our telephone lines, our hard lines. And has anybody ever used the hardline telephone, or are we all just, okay, yeah. So you guys know what I'm talking about, right? But, you know, cell phones were kind of the digital age. But this was a revolution, because with the invention of the telegraph, it was the first moment in human history where communication could transcend time and space almost instantaneously. Now, it was a little clunky, because has anybody ever seen like this before, like in a history documentary or anything, right? So telegraph, if you couldn't hear somebody's voice on it, you had there's dashes and dots and beeps and a little light thing. So people had to like encode messages, and there had to be somebody to interpret it on the other end. So it wasn't like, you know, as systematic as just picking up a telephone and telling somebody what you wanted to. It had to be interpreted, encoded, and all this stuff. But it allowed us to send messages as far as our telegraph lines could go. We didn't have to send a letter on horseback or on a train or some of those things. And so it was instantaneous. So it had a lot of impact. The United States was, you know, the place where this was really pioneered in terms of, you know, putting up lines, trying to connect both ends of the country. Well, really kind of east to Midwest at that point. But eventually we had lines that transcended the entirety of the United States. And then eventually those electronic telegraph lines became telephone lines once we developed the capability to send our voice over those same wired channels. And that made a huge difference on society. Communication was faster, it was quicker, it had impacts on the military. World War I, you know, we're still using the telegraph. Civil War, even we're using the telegraph. So it had a tremendous impact on our culture. Okay. And then now we kind of live in what Marshall McLuhan, even though he's far dead now, long dead, we live in kind of the electronic era or digital era. And his last point was kind of like what he kind of predicted the internet before the internet even was kind of a thought, or at least not in the way that we think of it now. But he thought eventually we'd all be connected by wireless communication and be able to instantly send and receive messages, okay? So he called this the global village, which if you go back and look at kind of the ways that he described things, he's basically describing the internet, okay? Now, another scholar that was really kind of one of the godfathers, we'll say, of media ecology, his name is Neil Postman, and he's one of my favorite, both authors, but also kind of scholars. He wrote several different books that are really fun to read, particularly considering when they were written, like the 1980s and the 90s, because he's kind of writing about us, but he almost seems very prophetic in some ways. One of them is Amusing Ourselves to Death. And this book is basically about how we're using things like television, you know, we would say the internet today, or YouTube, right? Instagram, TikTok, all of these things. But how we have these tremendous communication technologies at our fingertips, but we're using them to basically entertain ourselves and pacify ourselves, and we're not really using them to their full capacities. And his bigger point is that we don't always recognize the potential negative effects of communication technology. Our tendency is to, what do we do when a new iPhone comes out? Do we question whether it's actually better? Do we question what the social constants? No, it's new, so we have to buy it, right? We just accept new communication technology without thinking. And there are people out there now that are starting to question these. Like you've probably heard of some recent studies about the negative effects on self-esteem for young women in terms of high social media use. You know, some of you might have had, you know, conversations about that when you were in high school. So there are people who recognize this, but he was kind of one of the first people to do that. Another book, one of my favorites, is called Technopoly. And I know this is a little blurry, but the secondary title here is The Surrender of Culture to Technology. And that really summarizes his argument. He says that particularly in the United States, we surrender to any new form of technology and we let it run our lives. He said, whenever there's a new technology, communication technology, or technology in general, there are 5 things that we need to keep in mind. The first one is that culture always pays a price for technology. And he described this as a Faustian bargain. Anybody ever heard that term before? Anybody ever heard the term of a deal with the devil, right? It's whether you believe in the devil or not, right? It's making you're giving up something, right? You're selling your soul for something that you think is beneficial, but there's always like a negative on the backside of it. So what he says is that there's always a price that culture pays for new technology. So when we are continually using social media to communicate, when we're constantly in our phones, what might be a cost that we pay culturally? Any ideas? Okay, yeah, I mean, there's research that says that your generation in particular is not as effective or not as at least comfortable with communicating face to face. Maybe that doesn't, encapsulate your lived reality, but statistically, we can say that, some members of your generation are not as comfortable in things like professional interviews, just interacting with people that are a little bit older than you, right? Shaking hands, looking people in the eye, like some of these things that were considered very basic forms of natural communication. But what's natural communication to you is not necessarily the natural communication in the world that I grew up in. So his other point, the second one, is that there's always winners and losers in a technological change. Whenever a new technology is introduced, he says that there's always winners and losers. And so one of the examples that he gave is like the introduction or the moving away from the automobile, right? So prior to the automobile, so cars, right? There were these people called blacksmiths, and they would create shoes to put on horses, right? And that was their main form of income, and building wagons and all this kind of stuff. Well, once the automobile became an invention and really mass adopted, blacksmiths went away because we really didn't need blacksmiths anymore. So, but that wasn't something that the inventors of the automobile necessarily thought about. They just thought this is a really great technology. It's going to be faster than horse-drawn carriage. We're not going to have horse poop on the roads anymore, right? All kinds of different things. Some other costs would be the use of fossil fuels. I bet the first person who developed the combustion engine didn't think that billions of people would be using cars around the world and that all of that smog would cause the ozone to deteriorate. We just thought this was a cool invention. And so did we culturally. We thought, yeah, it's great to have a car. I can, go across the country in a limited amount of time. So there's always winners and losers. And this is a quote from that kind of particular chapter. Technology always has unforeseen consequences, and it's not always clear at the beginning who or what will win and who or what will lose. Okay. Third one, every technology embodies a philosophy, an epistemological, political, or social prejudice. So what he basically says in this one is within every new technology are one idea or several ideas that we don't always recognize. So let's talk about Instagram. What's an idea? What values are, what is valued on Instagram? So there's that built into the system, right? It's the likes, it's the self-esteem, it's all that stuff. But just on the surface, what is Instagram? What do we do with it? What do we post? Pictures. So what does it value? The image, right? Now, at Instagram, you guys know, do we just post any raw picture? We just take a picture and we put it up. No, why wouldn't we do that? Everybody be able to see it? What do we do beforehand? Well, before that even, right? We get the right angles, right? Maybe do some spray tan, all these things. The idea here is that built within Instagram, even though it's just a technology, it's just a thing, there's values, there's things that are valued, right? And it's the image is very valued. So it's a very superficial platform to some extent, right? We don't generally like ugly things on there, although there's kind of like a counter movement to that, you know, like, oh, I just woke up, I didn't put any makeup on or whatever, right? So, but for the most part, built within technologies are ideas that we don't always recognize. They teach us to value certain things over others. And as was already noted, there's also a scoring system now built into it, right? Where we get social esteem also tied to it as well. And one of the things that he said, or that he pointed to is this famous quote, there's different versions of it, but to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So, you know, if we have a tool that values, let's say, the visual image, we start to think that way, right? We start to think of the pictures that we take, and we also start to value things in the same way, okay? The fourth idea here, technological change is not additive, it's ecological. And this again goes to this idea of media ecology. And so what he says is that when we add something, when we add a communication technology, it's not just in addition to it, it changes everything. So and this is going back to the idea of ecology. So in ecology, if I go out into the mountains here, right, the forest, the woods, and I introduce a bunch of wolves. Let's say I take a group of 50 wolves and I put them out there. Is that the same forest? Is that the same environment? Why not? Okay, so they're predators, so they're gonna prey on other things, which changes the life of that, right? They also probably have some kind of ecological impact in terms of the routes that they continually walk around and all kinds of different things. And then we're probably going to introduce hunters at some point because we're going to have too many wolves. So we're not just adding wolves to an environment. We're not just adding technology to a particular environment. We're changing the whole environment. We're changing the culture. And this goes back to the medium is the message. So I think to kind of like put a bow on this, I want to kind of end with kind of the micro level impact or the interpretation of the medium as the message. So again, going back to Marshall McLuhan, this idea, I think it's really important, is that the channels that we use to communicate are the message to some extent. They are as important, if not more important, not only in terms of their cultural impact, but the impact it has on us. So let me ask you this question. If you've been dating somebody for 6 months, you consider them your boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, whatever. Is it okay to end that relationship via text message? Who says yes? Okay, why would it be yes?
It depends on like. That part.
Okay, but in general, would you want to be dumped? It's just out of the blue with a text. Okay. Now, have any of you started a relationship by texting?
Yeah.
Okay. Have any of you maintained a relationship by texting? Yeah. Okay. Why is it that we don't want to be dumped by a text? It's impersonal. That's important. Why is it impersonal? What is good about texting? What do we value, but also what makes it impersonal? Okay, so there's a couple things in there. One, it's really fast, right? That's why we value texting, right? How many people get a text message and you scroll down and you have to keep scrolling and it's like a paragraph? How many people like that? Nobody, right? You would say call me or let's talk in person, right? It's not a good medium for long form storytelling, right? You don't want to send a screenplay through a text message, all right? So at the heart of this question is the nature of the medium itself. The reason we like texting is it's quick, it's fast. I mean, it depends where you're texting from. You can add emojis and all this other stuff. But for the most part, it's one channel. It's purely text-based. When a relationship is ended, whether we're the dumper or the dumpee, one of the reasons it's uncomfortable is because of if we're in person, we see the emotion, we feel the emotion in other people's. The reason we like dumping people via text is because of the same reasons, right? It's easier. We don't have to see them cry. We don't have to hear the shakiness in their voice, even if we're on the phone. So the reason we all sort of resoundingly say that it's not cool to dump somebody or be dumped by a text is because of the nature of the medium itself. The medium is the message. When somebody chooses to dump you via a text, or when you choose to do it via text, that's the message. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter how cool they say you are, or that it's not you, it's them, or it's just a bad time for me. It doesn't matter what they say. The text itself, the fact that they chose to do it by text is the message itself. Now, this also works in on the other end as well, right? How many people have gotten a handwritten letter, maybe from like an older relative, grandpa, grandma, somebody, right? How does that make you feel when you open up and you see a handwritten letter?
Good.
Pretty good, right? Why do we like the handwritten letter? It shows that they care, but why? It takes a lot of effort to write a handwritten letter, right? So we know that embedded in that technology, in that medium of communication, there's some effort, there's some heart behind it, right? So that's kind of the individual impact here of this idea of the medium as the message. The technology itself, the channel or medium that we use to communicate is the message itself, or as at least as important as the content. Now, to be fair, getting dumped in person also sucks, right? So, you know, it's not, doesn't make it better necessarily, but we might say something like, at least we respect them for wanting to see us in person or letting us say our piece, you know, and some of those. Okay. I think I'm going to stop it right there for today. Okay. So there you go. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. We appreciate Jonathan's presentation and also appreciate you coming in. Jonathan will also be presenting research today at 2 p.m. in Ackerman 104. Jonathan's research presentation is entitled Toying with Identity, and we'll be talking about vintage toy collection in the context of media and communication. So we encourage you to attend again Ackerman 104 at 2 p.m. if you're interested. If you are here from interviewing, you're welcome to head out when you're ready and submit the extra credit when you're able. If you're here for communication theory, we will pivot to our student credit students. So thank you again, and we will, we'll be moving on and the theory things.
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to keep sharing?
We can close out of the meeting. Yeah. Thank you. I will join you in just a bit for lunch.